Hello, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, The Future of NATO C4ISR, Assessments and Recommendations After Madrid. Thank you for joining us today to those in our studio audience in Washington, D.C., and to those tuning in virtually from around the world. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The Center also honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. The Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative, which is hosting today's event, shapes and influences the debate on the greatest security challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance and its key partners. Today's discussion will focus on an underexplored yet crucial system underpinning the success of the NATO alliance and its operations, C4ISR: command and control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, is referred to as the nervous system of the military and is crucial to any mission. Russia's war in Ukraine has demonstrated the importance of C4ISR in the battlefield, and transatlantic policymakers are focusing on understanding how it will increasingly shape warfare and how it should be integrated into NATO's alliance structures. As we've seen in Ukraine, intelligence and reconnaissance were essential in both identifying early Russian troop buildup at the border and targeting Moscow's key strongholds. Flexible and responsive command and control structures allowed the Ukrainian military to rapidly adapt to evolving situations on the ground. And finally, ever better surveillance or awareness is essential for both Ukraine and NATO to remain agile in a contested geopolitical environment. However, understanding the importance of C4ISR is only the first step. The next step, maybe even more important, is to map what the NATO alliance needs to do next to enhance this foundational capability. To help illuminate this debate, we're hosting the event today and launching a foundational report on this topic. And I'd like to thank Leonardo for their generous support of this work, both the report and today's event. The report we're launching today is entitled The Future of NATO C4ISR, Assessment and Recommendations After Madrid. It's authored by Major General retired Gordon B. Skip Davis, Jr. The report highlights the vulnerabilities and opportunities for NATO C4ISR architecture of the future and discusses how the alliance can use the new strategic concept to make progress on this issue. Among other topics, the discussion will address how lessons learned from Russia's war in Ukraine should inform NATO's decision-making on C4ISR, how NATO C4ISR should respond to the changing character of warfare and ongoing and emerging threats such as terrorism, China, and climate change. The distinguished panel you're about to hear from will also identify innovative technologies NATO should prioritize, discuss how the alliance can better collaborate with the private sector, and address what steps the alliance should take at the Vilnius summit to maintain NATO C4ISR's military edge in today's and tomorrow's battlefield. Moderating today's discussion will be Leah Schoenenman, Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative. Before I turn it to Leah, a couple of housekeeping notes. I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. For our in-person audience, we'll take questions at the end of the moderated discussion. At that time, please feel free to queue at the microphone and pose your question. We encourage our online audience on Zoom to direct questions and insights to our speakers using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. When you ask a question, please be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation. We also encourage our online audience to join the conversation on Twitter, following @Atlantic Council and using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. Thank you for joining the Atlantic Council for what I know will be a terrific conversation. And without further ado, Leah, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Matt, for the opening remarks and setting the stage for the conversation today. I'm Leah Schoenenman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I am very pleased to be joined today with an in-person audience as well as our virtual audience and several virtual and in-person speakers as well, so truly making this hybrid new normal a reality. And we are delighted to today be launching our new publication, The Future of NATO C4ISR, Assessment and Recommendations After Madrid, which was the summit that NATO hosted last year in Madrid. And we are excited to be kind of kicking off a campaign of activities as we're looking towards the Vilnius summit in the agenda that NATO needs to be setting to ready itself for the future and the years to come. And we are very excited to have the author of this report with us join virtually, Major Generals Gordon B. Skip Davis, Jr. He is a retired Army Major General who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout Europe, and he's also, importantly, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO. And we are very happy to be launching a report today, Skip, and look forward to the conversation. We are also joined in person by retired General James Cartwright, Board Director with the Atlantic Council and former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you've had a long career in the military, and I'm sure you need very little introduction in this crowd especially, but you are widely recognized in your 40 years of service as for your technical acumen, your vision of national security concepts, nuclear deterrence, and we're excited especially to dig into some of that acquisition and innovation, I think, experience, which will be very useful for today's discussion. And then also joining us in person is John Baylouni, if I pronounced that correctly, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Leonardo DRS, a leading company for multi-domain capabilities in the aerospace, defense, and security sector. And Mr. Baylouni has more than 30 years of experience in the aerospace and defense industry, advancing from engineering to engineering leadership and now to business leadership roles. Leonardo is also the sponsor of this report today, so we're very happy for your continued support for our programming and for the Transatlantic Security Initiative especially. And then last but not least, we are also joined virtually by Ms. Cheryl Lingell, Director of Force Modernization and the Employment Program at the Project Air Force at the RAND Corporation. And Ms. Lingell is a leading expert in security and defense issues, and her research covers many topics, including complexity and great power competition, warfare and multi-domain operations, JADC2ISR capabilities, and highly contested environments, and air and missile defense. And so I think I covered almost every aspect of C4ISR in that, which I'm very excited to have you joining us, Ms. Lingell, virtually today. And so it is my pleasure to welcome all of you as well as our in-person audience. And I also want to, before we kick off, remind a few folks of the housekeeping rules, and we also have a virtual audience joining us online, and you could follow along the conversation using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. And then for those watching on Zoom, you can use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions, and we can get to those later on in the program. And then if you're in the in-person audience, please feel free to raise your hand, and our colleagues can direct you towards the microphone, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. So I think to start us off, Skip, I would like to come to you first. So we're launching today your excellent report on NATO C4ISR architecture, and congratulations firstly on that, because it is a very great report and extremely comprehensive. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that when they have time over the coming weeks to read through that. To start us off, could you please tell us why C4ISR is important in the current context and what you have learned through your research about the changes needed for NATO's C4ISR architecture especially?
Well, thanks, Leah, for the question. And I must say, I love the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. It's a great start to this report and getting it out there. But it's a real pleasure to participate in today's launch. And I really want to thank the Atlantic Council and Leonardo for their support and sponsorship, but also the academic freedom I enjoyed in preparing the report. And with that, a shout out to the editing staff, in particular, Anka and Vilta, who have been outstanding in their support. So let me just answer the question briefly, starting with describing NATO C4ISR, and Matt's done that for us, but it's really a system of capabilities, a set of capabilities, which are quite broad, not all necessarily always addressed, in a connected manner. So, but they are connected in terms of what they deliver in terms of effects and service. So, command and control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Significance. Matt talked about it being the nervous system. It's the nervous system of any system, any service or any military. It enables situational awareness. It enables decision-making and action. It enables the alliance, NATO C4ISR, enables the alliance and allies to see, understand, decide, and act, and then monitor and assess that action that they take. And for those familiar with the John Boyd's OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, the force with the more effective OODA loop will dominate its adversary. In other words, faster, more accurate, more shared and connected, and hence the importance of C4ISR in enabling that OODA loop. Now, C4ISR architecture, a common NATO definition doesn't yet exist. It's one of my recommendations. The term architecture does exist for things like C3, that's consultation, command, and control in NATO speak, joint ISR, and a few other capability areas. And what I mean by NATO C4ISR architecture is the whole shebang: systems, structures, organizations, its forces, its networks, its applications, policies, concepts, and procedures. All those things that connected help decision makers, operators, intelligence professionals, support through those capabilities NATO's shared awareness, decision making, and execution, in particular in a multi-domain environment. So first off, adopting common definition is not just an academic effort. In my view, it would have real significance and impact. It would enhance defense planning efforts, enable common assessment, enable coherence and concept and capability development, all of which are functions that NATO conducts on behalf of allies. And so that's my importance of the recommendation. Now, to answer your question, in a few words, what I learned from my research and my own experience in NATO as a senior leader in the military and then as a senior civilian leader in the last few years is that NATO and allies have made significant progress in improving NATO's collective, multinational, and individual national C4ISR capabilities and the associated concepts, policies, and procedures. But key shortfalls and vulnerabilities remain, and they're important in the current environmental context. And the time is now to address those shortfalls and vulnerabilities because NATO is united. It has an agreed vision for the future. The threats are clear and close. Political commitment is high. Industry is capable. But again, follow through is needed to address the obstacles and friction and ensure the right investment. Just 2 words on Madrid and the road ahead. A new level of political ambition was set at last year's Madrid summit. A new strategic concept was adopted with revised core tasks, a clear text on strategic threats and challenges, plans for strengthening NATO security and defense, as well as resilience, and the decisions at Madrid and their implementation will set the current and future requirements for NATO C4ISR and will also enable their deployment, their kind of interconnectivity and employment. So decisions taken at 2022 will lead to further policies, plans, and actions by this year's summit in Vilnius. So my report aims to inform the public, industry, academia, national and NATO leadership on where NATO is heading, and considerations or issues it should address to develop, deliver, and employ the C4ISR architecture that NATO needs to maintain its technological edge and comparative military advantage. Thank you.
That's very helpful, and I think I'll turn to General Cartwright next, who wrote the foreword for Skip's great report. If I could ask you maybe a broad question. Skip has laid out already some of the recommendations, and I definitely want to hear all of your thoughts on these as well, but could you describe in layman's terms what the importance of C4ISR is for military operations today, maybe especially in the context of what we're seeing with Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine on the battlefield today?
My sense here, and first, this is a really good report. I recommend it. It's got some very hitting and very insightful recommendations on the progress that we could make in C4ISR. It's good to break down C4ISR
Yes.
rather than aggregate up just as a starting point. And so the front end, command and control, are functions. They're the decision-making and the dissemination of those decisions to operational activities and support activities down the chain of command. The middle piece, which is the communications and computers, the communications is an architecture of distribution to whoever the relevant organizations are that would receive these authoritative commands and control activities. Computers is kind of a, let's call it almost an acronym. Because the reality is, it is all of the functions that are associated with computers. It's the computational power, it's the storage, it's the movement of data and information that data represents, down through the architecture to the nodes that are the commands, the support activities, and the actual employment of force if we get to that point. And then the last three, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, are missions. Okay? So it represents decisions all the way to execution. And therefore it becomes the nervous system, it becomes the underpinning of the activities, it also becomes the underpinning of the strategies that we put in place. So multi-domain operations, things like that, are basically supported by that architecture. That architecture was never really envisioned multi-domain when it was put together. It's been updated through the years, but quite frankly, it lags rather than leads. And that's, I think, one of the key recommendations here is it's got to get back in front. We've got to bring it up to date. Much of that activity, depending on where you sit, could be the platforms and the functions of those platforms and how we do that kind of work and what we can do there. Some of it is in how we do command and control, particularly with our allies in large organizations. But these centerpieces of the network, making sure that network is now living in a cyber environment, that it's resilient and that it can in fact do its job. And then the computer side of this equation is really where you start to see the leverage of the future. This is where things like AI will reside, quite frankly. I mean, it'll be all through that, but the architecture, that individual nodes, thinking of them as edge points, how much information to what nodes with what relevance, and this concept of speed of relevance. So if I'm just doing something that just needs to take days and weeks, I don't have the priorities. If it is fires and it takes milliseconds, that's got to be able and accommodated by this network. And so the breadth of the network and the functions have dramatically grown over the years. And I think that's what's really important for the listener here today to understand is this is addressing that growth, but it's also addressing the leap forward, not just the incremental progress.
That's really helpful. I especially like the breakdown between the C2, the communications and computers, and then ISR, maybe looking at them a little bit separately helps understand the bigger picture. But I think I'm going to turn to John next, because where you stand is where you sit, and we have some particular perspectives already being shared. But from the industry perspective, this larger architecture that General Cartwright has just laid out presents challenges, obviously, from the government and the military perspectives, and then even more complicated when you're talking about multinational military alliance like NATO. From your perspective, though, what do you think the biggest challenges are? Maybe what governments and militaries right now aren't getting right, and where you would see the future of maybe broad investments going. But we can dive into this more in a bit as well. If it's a long answer, I assume.
Yeah. So first, let me thank you for the Atlantic Council and for the report, Skip. Excellent job, outstanding report, great recommendations. Jim, great forward. And I want to maybe back up a second. I think of C4ISR the same way. It's a nervous system. But I think about it the way that a human would sense. ISR to me is the sensing part. It's the optics, it's the RF, it's the acoustics, whatever's happening on the battlefield. The computers and so forth are the brains, the making sense out of what that information that's coming from the sensors. And making sense out of what's happening in the battle space is extremely important. And both of the speakers so far have talked about speed. And to me, what we're learning is that speed is of the essence. Everybody is going to know where everybody else is on the battle space eventually. The question is, can we know sooner, and can we act faster? And this is where this architecture needs to lead. And so for me, the challenges of this architecture are interoperability, which is really where this started. is getting our allies on the same page and having a joint understanding of the battle space, having access to each other's sensors, having access to each other's understanding of the battle space, which means communications, and it means fast communications. It means distributing this understanding across the battle space quickly. And so that's where I would go. I think that there's a lot of technology that's coming to the forefront. We're seeing some of it being used in Ukraine. The private sector is bringing satellite imagery, satellite RF sensing, satellite communications to the fold. They have to be part of this architecture. We're going to want to take advantage of everything that we can on the battle space, whether it's private sector or public sector. Those sensors have to be aggregated, and Jim, you mentioned AI. Making sense out of this is potentially going to make use of AI. We'll have a caution there later. But I think that the most important part of this is making use out of everything that's there. All this data is going to be presented. The faster you can make sense out of it and distribute it to your allies, the better off you're going to be on the battle space.
It's a great point on no longer an ability to hide, so you need to be moving faster and thinking faster. And then as we're growing our capability to process the information, that obviously leads to further opportunities for getting even more information, right? More sensors out on the field to be able to see these things more quickly. Ms. Lingell, Cheryl, I would like to turn to you and ask, maybe we've talked a little bit already about Ukraine, but from your perspective, especially as an expert at RAND Corporation, can you speak to how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has affected your thinking about the readiness of NATO C4ISR and what we've seen on the battlefield?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm going to take a step back, though.
Taking a step back, that's totally fine.
Fair enough. So Skip, first of all, it was a very interesting report. He covered a lot of ground in this report. And he talked about 3 categories that needed to transform. And I think this applies definitely to NATO. It applies to the United States Air Forces and maritime component, et cetera. In terms of transforming the people and the processes and the technologies. In fiscal year 2019, RAND looked at work for the Air Force on artificial intelligence applications for JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And if you remember back into sort of 2018, 2019 timeframe, that was when there was a change in sort of rebranding, if you will, from Multidomain Command and Control to JADC2. And there was also this new heightened interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And from this study, what we found were very similar themes for the Air Force that are in this report. Namely that C2 organizations, the processes and the technologies or systems or digital infrastructure, if you will, are antiquated and they're ill-suited for the speed and the scale that were needed for the high-end conflict. And we certainly see this today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. An enterprise-wide effort is needed. And as John mentioned, that is pulling in industry. That's, I think Jim mentioned this too. I mean, it gets into the training, it gets into really this whole broad enterprise effort that needs to happen to transform capabilities, not just the technologies in terms of the digital infrastructure, but also in terms of the connectivity. How do we think about command and control? How do we think about distributed command and control? How do we think about authorities changing over time? I think getting back to your original question, though, for Russia and Ukraine war and what have we learned, I think one thing that really struck me was that we are in a situation that is a non-Article 5 scenario. Do we plan and train for these scenarios? What other scenarios should we be planning for from a NATO perspective? So maybe I'm asking a question for the rest of the group here today as well. I think this is something that's lacking in the current environment, and that's part of thinking about how are we going to command and control and have the information flow going, again, back to Jim's comments about the connectivity, the availability of existing information, and how are we sharing that information?
That's very helpful. I think maybe if I can turn the question to Skip, who has written the Bible on this topic already. Skip, if you could maybe tackle some of Dr. Lingel's comments here, but I think especially this point on exercising the capabilities. We haven't touched on that yet, but in terms of looking through the many challenges that exist to bolstering NATO's capabilities across the whole suite of C4ISR, how do you view exercises as part of this broader picture, as well as obviously where you sat in the defense investment side? I think the money in the investment is also obviously a big missing link here as well, but let's skip over to you.
Okay, so let me step back and talk about, this is now kind of a trend, step back a little bit, talk a little about the bigger lessons, and then drill down in a little bit to this training aspect, exercises, et cetera. So in terms of the readiness issues, one of the key things in my report that I kind of focus on is this idea of day zero readiness. Even though we saw this long buildup of forces over time, we had the luxury of time and space to consider what the implications might be to NATO, how we're going to assure the allies that we're closest to the fight, how we continue support to Ukraine, how we can continue to deter, aggression against Europe. Okay, but it also, I think, has highlighted the need for NATO mission-ready networks, forces, headquarters, systems, immediately, be they for massive cyber attack, be they for massive missile strike. Okay, and so that's changed the mindset, within NATO. It requires a different type of approach, which has led to this idea about deterrence by denial. Okay, that's one aspect we can talk a little bit later. The other aspect that we were just, that Cheryl was just addressing was this idea of multi-domain operations. They're here. It's now. It's not something for the future. Now, NATO hasn't adopted joint all-domain, but some nations have, other than the U.S. We listened to the chief of the French Air Force last week, and talking to him, they talked joint all-domain, in their context at home. But it's the same as multi-domain operations in terms of description of what it's meant to achieve in terms of synchronizing military operations with non-military activities, for multi-domain effects at the speed of relevance. That's kind of the NATO approach here. But the bottom line is the force that can master that will dominate. And we're seeing that, by a much smaller, creative, courageous, committed force, within Ukraine against the barbaric, incompetent, and massive Russian onslaught. The next, I think, would say was that in terms of readiness, yes, critical that we improve readiness, but the NATO intelligence enterprise did a pretty good job. They surged in terms of the employment of their own assets, and these are the RQ-4s and the NATO Alliance Ground Surveillance Force, the AWACS E3 Alphas, and the NATO Airborne and Early Warning and Control Force. Okay, that's a long acronym, but nonetheless, a long name. They responded to the need. They moved out to the forward edge. They began, a significant amount of flights, into the region to collect information, collect intelligence, then process it rapidly, and then provide that information and intelligence from within their own capabilities, but also with contributions from nations to allow for both the operational military picture and the strategic political decision making. So that worked, and so that's a good news story. And the processes for rapid, collection management and dissemination worked. They exposed some weaknesses, they exposed some vulnerabilities, and those are part of my recommendations. Another thing that I think is extremely important, which gets to where training and exercise is coming, is this idea that we've got to have capabilities that provide persistent surveillance if we're going to respond at the speed of relevance. First of all, understand fast enough to be able to respond to the speed of relevance and identify those indicators and warnings that tell us there's something big about to happen or where it just came from, so we can respond appropriately. But nonetheless, we don't have persistent surveillance right now. We don't have the plethora of systems or the contributions from nations or the collective fabric to provide that. There's some neat initiatives underway, which we can talk about as well. The other aspect, though, is survivability. This is a extremely lethal environment for C2 nodes, for anything that's land communications, as well as any type of activity in the electromagnetic spectrum because of the jamming capabilities and counter C2 or EW capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities that Russia has. And it's extremely lethal for anything that can be seen from the air, be it air or space. Think of all the C2 nodes that have been so effectively attacked, either based on, fused intelligence from space-based civilian reporting or the ubiquitous drones that are now on the battlefield. So survivability is something that's really going to be difficult for training and exercises. As a Cold War, soldier in my infancy, we had air guards, but we haven't had to look up for the last, 20 years for significant air threats. We do now, and of all types and speeds and capabilities. The next thing I would say is that we've got to practice, train, and certainly set the systems and architecture up for multidimensional intelligence and fusion. We've got a lot of imagery, and we have a lot of some signals intelligence, not SIGINT that we would think in terms of communications intelligence, but we have measures through our synthetic aperture radar and ground movement target indicator types of capabilities on the AGS, the RQ4, and nations have all sorts of other imagery capabilities, electrical optical, IR, infrared, as well as space-based capabilities that they can contribute, and they are. It's not all contributed; it tends to be contributed as finished products, not as raw data. But eventually, we would like to be able to have raw data provided, and we have to have the capacity that Jim Cartwright talked about in terms of storage, access management, and then dissemination. So those are things. And talking about dissemination, there's an information management process which is commonly referred to as tasking, collecting, processing, exploiting, and disseminating information. So TCPED, as it's shortened. And there's a considerable amount of capacity in the system, but right now there are, I would say, bottlenecks in the number of analysts made available to analyze that, as well as the storage and processing capability, which lacks the kinds of AI, machine learning tools needed for rapid ingest and understanding and making sense, as John talked about. And then the last, two that I'll just talk about. I'll hold cyber perhaps for a later discussion, but in my view, private industry, as John just mentioned, has had an incredible role, as has civil society. We can think of all the pro bono crowd funding support that's provided, but also rapid accelerated delivery and fielding of equipment, and also software centric solutions. I don't know if people have heard about the Delta system, which was announced formally about a month ago from Ukraine. Incredible ability to bring both secure and open source intelligence sources, crowdsourced social media, all together to track Russian forces on the battlefield and disseminate that to potential sensor effectors through C2. And it's available on laptops and iPhones, smartphones, and computers. Not just on the safe, dry command and control headquarters, kilometers away from the battlefield, and so that's new. The space link communications, incredible. The cybersecurity provided by the big ICT companies, have all made a huge impact. Mm-hmm. And so lots there. The last one is this data and network architecture. I called it digitalization, big data, and connectivity. But it's that collection of digitalized information from all sorts of signals, print and electronic media, connectivity that's efficient but robust, resilient, common data, frameworks with standard and recognized protocols, interfaces, and then tools like AI, machine learning, cloud services, et cetera, to enable that data sharing across the battle space with political, military, national government, leaders for coordination, collaboration of the civil activities of multi-domain operations. And that's here now. We're seeing it in spades, maybe not at the level and scale we need for the alliance, but we're seeing it applied incredibly well, within the Ukrainian battlefield. We've got to be able to, train on those aspects of multi-domain operations and threats in a high-intensity conflict, and have the tools we need to have C4ISR enable the nervous system, but also enable C4ISR connectivity and sharing in the first place.
That was a lot. Thank you, Skip. I think there are several different threads I think I want to pull on. Maybe starting with John. So as Skip mentioned, we are in a new environment where, for the U.S. at least, we have not ever had to be looking up. We've had air dominance in most of the situations that we've been in the past, the conflicts we've been involved in the past decades at least. That being said, even though neither side in the Russian invasion of Ukraine has established air dominance, there is a lot of stuff flying around, and especially this week, that stuff hit the news. So I wanted to ask, from an industry standpoint, how are you thinking about this question of that Skip raised about survivability, which I think is especially a changed context now that we're talking about a lot more unmanned systems, especially those systems that are being used for ISR purposes, which we know that the Ukrainian military is using to good effect. But then we've also seen this week that the United States has a lot of capability for ISR in that region as well, and the Russian forces have now been able to take out one of those systems. Can you talk from an industry perspective about how you're thinking about that challenge?
Sure, and as an industry, we've seen that this was a weakness of our forces for some time, and we haven't been investing in short-range air defense and on a smaller basis, vehicle protection and counter UAS. We look at this as an onion with layers, right? And so we as an industry have started investing pretty heavily on trying to create those layers of protection, whether it's a short-range air defense layer, a counter UAS layer to knock down some of these commercial drones, and then to protect the vehicles themselves. And so we've been investing heavily in these areas. We're starting to see some of that make its way into theater, into Ukraine and other theaters. And this is something that I think as Skip mentioned, it's a weakness of our forces today to protect those C2 nodes and really to protect all of our platforms and forces. So we've seen this, we've been investing in it. We see this as an opportunity, though, to kind of aggregate into the ISR domain as well. So these protection systems all have sensors on them as well. And those sensors can provide part of the picture to make sense out of the battlefield. So we're trying to aggregate these sensor outputs into raw or processed into the overall network to add to the JADC2 kind of for the multi-domain operations picture. And so that's kind of aspirational for us. That's where we're headed. That's where we're investing. First, protect our platform and our troops, and then build out that sensor network.
And how are you thinking about the issue of, we just have so many more platforms around now than in past warfare. How are you thinking about not just the survivability of the platform and the continued operations, but the technology that's in those platforms, and how important is it to protect that technology in those platforms and ensure that it's not being exploited by enemy forces who are able to take control?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the cyber protection, the trusted computing element is a very key part of this. And we've been investing heavily in this as well to ensure that if something is captured, it's not going to be a vulnerability of our network. These computers that Jim talked about, they're on the edge of the battlefield. They're going to get captured. So we have to make sure that they don't end up being a window into our network. And so we've built in technology. We're investing in that technology to make sure that doesn't happen. So if I go a few years into the future, perhaps, what we see is an increasingly autonomous, we don't think we're going to put soldiers in a platform and send them over the hill into a contested zone any longer. We're going to put a robotic vehicle up there. And the robotic vehicle is going to be remotely piloted, or it's going to have our eyes and ears on it. And it's going to have some computing capability. And that computing capability has to say what's going on up here. And that picture has to be fused with the larger ISR picture into the C4ISR architecture.
That's really helpful. And I think so. One of the other many threads that Skip mentioned, and we've kind of talked a little bit around it, but maybe specifically for Jim and then also for Cheryl, on the new concept that NATO will be adopting soon, that NATO Allied Command Transformation is working on a concept for multi-domain operations, or what's also called here in the US, joint all-domain operations, and is referred to variously by other allies by various names. Can you speak to some of the lessons that we're seeing, again, emerging lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine for C4ISR and how that should impact NATO's multi-domain operations concept going forward? We've talked around this a lot already, the integration piece especially. But.
One, I hesitate to take too much of a lesson from any ongoing fight. One, because it's narrow. It doesn't apply to our full range of military requirements and operations. And two, because it's emergent and what we think we see may not be the reality, number one. And number two, which is the bigger problem, is where you sit is how you see it. Okay, so if I'm artillery, this war was saved and run by artillery. If I'm an aviator, you pick it. Okay?
And if you're a board director at the
And if you're a board
Council?
director, you're more reports. But I think what's important here is to start to understand the shortfalls in this C4ISR architecture. I would say starting with non-kinetic fires and the early stages, the phase zeros and the phase ones, and influence and understanding the battle space, and probably taking on the most difficult thing of all, which is understanding intent. What does our adversary really intend here? Are we misreading it? Are we understanding it correctly? And these ideas of persistence and survivability allow us the tools to start to come in closer. But it's clear that the C4ISR architecture was really not designed that way. It's adequate, but all of the things that all of the speakers have talked about are things that really need to be improved in that environment. But fusing the non-kinetic and the kinetic part of the activities, of the sensing, of the fight, et cetera, is not something we do well. We do them separately, and we schedule them, and we deconflict them. And part of what we're trying to do with the JADC2 effort and part of what we're trying to do with multi-domain operations is to say those artificial boundaries are causing us problems. And we've got to find a way to operate through and across them seamlessly, and we have to have accountability for that capability to do that, okay? And that's a lot of what people, I believe, are trying to understand now. And what are the pieces? What takes us in that direction? How do we think about the conflict more holistically in exercises, but all the way from phase zero through kinetic activities, okay? And so those are the pieces that are somewhat missing right now that we've got to work our way through. There are a lot of capabilities in the commercial sector that point towards capabilities we probably need in the defense sector, we'll call it that, the national security sector. Bringing them in is not necessarily a one-for-one for a lot of reasons. But I think probably the most difficult piece is the acronym that we haven't thrown out yet, which is the sharing acronym. Okay, how do you get to that? How do you go across all these domains? How do you fuse all of this activity and get past the sharing piece? Not past it, but incorporated into it. So my starting point would be that I will take a democratic approach to warfare over an autocratic anytime, because the group will beat the individual. It may take a while. We may have tried everything before we try success, but the group will win. Okay, so the aggregation is important, and we should not, in the sharing construct, wipe out the perspectives of all of the players. Okay, then you end up in a place where we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we have all these caveats. You thou shalt not, but you should. And so it makes it a very difficult battle space. So classification, caveats, those are all things that we shouldn't try to get rid of. Those are things that we ought to embrace, but embrace in a way that allows the intent and the understanding to be fused throughout this battle space. Okay? The last piece on this is the speed piece, which is to say, a lot of people look at C4ISR as, okay, this is how I make decisions. I've got a bunch of analysts, they look over all this stuff, and then I give it to a decision maker. That's one piece. There's another guy that needs it in less than 20 milliseconds, and that's the trigger puller. Okay? And right now, he gets nothing out of C4ISR. He might get a brief before he steps out onto the street, okay? But that's the best he'll get, and he'll sleep through that. That's just an opportunity to sleep, quite frankly. It's not going to be relevant. It's been out there in the space for 20 days before he sees it, or she. And so the issue here is, how do we make this speed of relevance all the way to the tactical edge? Okay, it's the old, fifth grade, line the people up across the stage and whisper something in somebody's ear, and by the time it gets to the other end, it's, how different is this from what I started?
Well, I really hope it's not like that.
It is today. It quite frankly is in most cases. It goes down through multiple headquarters who reword it, restate it, and pass it along. And what's fundamentally different in Ukraine right now is it's going directly from the top to all the nodes simultaneously. Okay? And any one of those nodes is capable of independent action when it gets that information. Okay? That's a fundamental shift. So we're moving in the right direction. The architecture doesn't necessarily support it. A lot of the things you see, like I'm going to use a space sensor to give to an airplane. Okay, that's interesting, but it is not integrated. It is just a demo. Okay, fundamental change. The other piece that you have to understand in C4ISR is we have an entire legacy system built up. That system is not digital. It is not made to be digital. It has pieces of digital, but fusing this stuff together is not running a wire. There's a much larger industry piece that has to be put into this. You have to be born digital to really work in this environment. And that's a fundamental shift. So the good news is, as this investment comes, particularly in Europe, there's not a lot of legacy there. So you're going to be able to integrate this relatively quickly in comparison to the United States, who still is fighting over whether or not to keep the A-10. It's just, we have a legacy force that needs to be brought forward, and you can't just say, wave your hand and it's all of a sudden digital. It doesn't work that way. That is tens of billions of dollars to do that kind of work, and it's going to take us probably 10 years to do it effectively. So this is the movement that we're seeing, and it's compelling, but we got a lot of work to do here to make it work.
It's really helpful. Cheryl, can I ask you to come in, especially with your perspective, having researched these topics for many years now, looking at this multi-domain operations piece. Obviously, there are lessons from the U.S. experience of already not being able to adopt our legacy systems, but could you also speak to maybe the Alliancewide efforts or what you've seen so far in your research?
Yeah, so, Jim said things very, very well just now, I have to say, where he started with talking about intent and trying to understand the intent of the adversary. I think that's where we need to be, but then what capabilities do we need to get there? And as I mentioned in the work that we've done in the past, we started off trying to look at artificial intelligence and all these advanced capabilities. And to Jim's earlier point, we have an industrial age architecture. We have stovepipes. We have person in the loop for most steps that happen within command and control and also within the ISR environment. And so we need to make this holistic switch to digital infrastructure, which sounds like maybe NATO might have a leg up on the U.S. In the regard of not being tied to our legacy environments that we are so tied to right now. I think when we talk about multi-domain operations and enabling them, because essentially C4ISR are enablers, right? They're enablers for missions. And I think as you start looking across the missions that you're trying to enable, there's just a fundamental common theme that comes here. And we've all talked about it a little bit here. I'm going to use the phrase that's used in the US, which is a common operational picture. We need to start with having a common operational picture of what's happening. Where are the NATO forces? What are the NATO assets and capabilities? What's the maybe NGO or non-combatants? What's the adversary's forces and disposition and activities? Without having a shared common operational picture, it's hard to come to an agreement on what that intent is going to be from our interpretation of our information that we have. So I would say that would be a fundamental thing that needs to be pursued. And there are efforts that are underway to do that for different mission capabilities. So I would say that would be one just foundational thing for supporting multi-domain operational capabilities. And then I think what needs to happen is you need to think through, well, what are those missions that we're trying to enable specifically? Integrated air and missile defense would be one obvious one. John was referencing that in terms of counter UAS capabilities and defending our own forces and the like. So thinking through, what does that mean in terms of the command and control capabilities that we need for that? How do they need to be, I'll call them attributes that command and control needs to have in terms of flexibility and agility, the adaptability of command and control and ISR capabilities. I think that is an observation that I've taken from the war in Ukraine, is the ability for the Ukrainians to be more flexible and adaptable, to empower lower echelons to make some decisions and respond to the data that they're getting in hand in a timely manner. So those are just sort of starting points. I think we need to think through what are those key missions and where should NATO be focused, and to focus those efforts in terms of, again, going back to Skip's report, right? Talking about the people piece, the processes that are in place. What are the planning processes? What are the assessment of those operations processes kind of thing? And then also the technology, that digital infrastructure that's needed to sort of undergird what you're doing. But again, these are all enablers for what? For multi-domain operational capabilities.
I think one of the key pieces also that we've seen from Ukraine so far is the critical importance of intelligence sharing between the NATO alliance and Ukraine, between the US bilaterally with Ukraine, the UK bilaterally with Ukraine, and then Ukraine's own ability to really lock down its information system. We have not seen any significant leaks from the Ukrainian government or the military, which is really incredible. But Skip, you addressed some of this in your report at the NATO level. Are there things that are kind of low-hanging fruit that NATO could be addressing in the lead up to the Vilnius summit, and maybe announcing or rolling out at the Vilnius summit, especially in July, that would enable better, faster intelligence sharing among allies at the NATO level?
Well, there's two things that I would recommend. They're not on the current list of summit deliverables, at least not from my, in headquarters inside, or G2 as we might call it. But a pledge for greater data sharing and for intelligence sharing. That's one of my major, in fact, it's the first key recommendation that I focus on, because that's the fuel of C4ISR. That's really one of the greatest added values of NATO is its collected ability to collect and store and then analyze intelligence and process it for senior level, both political and military decision making. And certainly when forces are together, their ability to then employ that intelligence assets or capabilities for, appropriate responses and actions. So the data sharing, intelligence sharing is critical. It needs, the right kinds of, foundations. In other words, secure networks and data architecture that can hold massive amounts of classified data. And NATO is just starting to dip its toe into cloud services for NATO unclassified, and is looking at NATO restricted, which is kind of our for official use only level of classification. They're not yet to confidential or secret or other higher classifications. So that's all work to be done. But establishing that data architecture to enable the sharing and intelligence, and then of course I talked about TCPED, this ability to rapidly process. There's all sorts of elements of the framework to enable massive, data and intelligence processing. But there's still some key analysts' billets not yet filled in places like the NATO AGS force, which has an incredible capability to analyze and process data as a hub. The NATO Intelligence Fusion Center, which is smaller number of billets, but does a significant amount on imagery and process intelligence products, et cetera. And so, that's one aspect. But then you talk about people, processes, and technology. Processes are largely there. There's a lot of neat intelligence functional services, processes already in place for collaboration and then receipt, rapid dissemination. But the technology is still short on cloud services, AI, and machine learning tools that are not yet there. There's been, again, this is another little toe dipping into the water. That you may not be aware, but it's been really reported much. But there's a great AI tool that was given to the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center last year as a test case, one of their use cases for AI, where they just did analysis of mass loads of imagery data to just track the order of battle of Russian air assets, to figure out what was flying, what was being lost as casualties. What the effectiveness of all that system. So that's allowed NIFC analysts to maintain a near real-time, track of what would normally be, way beyond the analyst man hours or win hours available to do that mission. So those are some of the ideas that I would talk about in regard to the question.
It's really interesting. I hadn't heard of that AI capability to be able to track the Russian order battle, at least in the airspace. That's, I think, something maybe we haven't hit on as much yet is on the capability development side of things. So NATO has been investing in a lot more capacity to be able to do joint innovation through the Diana and other efforts at NATO. But I want to ask maybe particularly to John, from your perspective, how can NATO better enable national capability development as well as joint capability development, especially when we're talking about this C4ISR suite of capacities? We talked through some of the processes. You've already mentioned emerging and disruptive technologies like AI especially, but especially when we're talking about this sort of valley of death of translating things from experimentation to actually scaling at speed. How are you thinking about these issues?
Well, I think that we have to back up a second and talk about how to get to just a connective and sharing of information first. This common operating picture sharing is something that's really right here. One of the things that we're learning about this Ukrainian invasion is the outpouring of support from different nations. All these different platforms are showing up. They have different battle management systems, for instance. So different network connections, different radio connectivity. So being able to kind of standardize and say, okay, this is the battle management system that we want want to build off of. This is the network connectivity we want to build off of, sharing the keys and the cryptology needed to share that data at a classified level. All of that has to happen to get to a basic layer here. So if you're talking about building capability at the alliance level, NATO level, you have to start. I think you have to start with some standardization. Open systems architecture. You have to start talking about where the data is going to flow. You want to go to digital architecture. The data routes have to be predetermined. You have to know this data is going to go there, there, or there, so the human being doesn't have to touch it. So you can get that real-time access that the folks that need it in 30 milliseconds get it raw. And we're not talking about data product. We're not talking about intelligence products. We're talking about raw data. Who's over the hill? Where's that shot coming from? All of that information can be had kind of instantaneously if we standardize in some open system architectures, standardize on the keys and share them, right? I think we have to be data-centric. I think we have to push toward a data-centric world. This data is going to come from here. It's going to go to these places, and it automatically gets routed that way. And I think this is within touch. We just have to, have the will, right, to do that.
I think the standardization is such a key piece too, and it's not a new lesson, right? I mean, we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan when you're providing 10 different types of trucks to the same host nation, it's really hard, if not impossible, to integrate and to actually maintain those systems as well, which is a whole other panel discussion that I don't think we can get to right now. So we are approaching the 30-minute mark, and I would like to open it up for questions to those in the audience here in person as well, and then we have a few coming in virtually, which I can start to address here because I'm excited about the first one from former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment, Peter Flory. And I'll pose this to the group if anyone wants to chime in, especially though, let me know. Otherwise, I'm sure Skip will want to answer this one as well. To the extent that you can discuss it, how is NATO using its Alliance Ground Surveillance, AGS system in the Ukraine crisis? And there were a number of operational and financing issues that had to be resolved before AGS finally went final. How do these procedures work in practice? And then maybe with an additional caveat from our Transatlantic Security Initiative Associate Director and Resident Fellow Anka Agaki, what are some of the lessons for places such as the Black Sea region based on this, what we're seeing so far for NATO AGS? Maybe Cheryl, you were smiling. Bad smiling, okay. Skip, please.
Well, I'll say something, but let's Skip take this one
okay,
first.
Great, Skip, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Leah, and thanks to Peter for the question. His photo is still up in the Defense Investment Division Hall, so glad to know that he's still connected and interested in NATO issues and left a great impact. So the first question is that NATO AGS, is at initial operating capability, at least in terms of the SACEUR's assessment. And that's generally because there are still some billet, unyet filled or unfilled. I should say billet still unfilled. Infrastructure still, to be delivered. And so that's kind of the limit factors right now, not the systems themselves or pilots, so to speak, or even enough analysts to process what the AGS can provide currently. But they were built 5 to really provide one continuous orbit. And a little bit of surge to 2 from time to time. So it's a limited capability. It's not a massive capacity that can be spread out across the alliance to gather information on a continuous basis. So given its limitations, it's done extremely well because it has fought through all sorts of operational and funding issues. And here we're talking about just airspace, traffic management, weather, and conditions, as well as, the fact that they were getting quite close to the battle space. There could have been, the kind of incident we saw just the other day with, the Russian MiGs and the U.S. MQ-4. So that's always a potential out there that, the Allies are very keen on, addressing in terms of risk, but also, funding because the operational budget was nowhere near the amount it needed to, planned for 24/7 operations, and the Allies have funded what was required. And the AGS force has responded, in kind with the kinds of intelligence that was needed, and then also really been responsive to the kinds of taskings that the political and senior military leadership, needed in terms of feedback from what the AGS, the RQ4 was able to capture. Now, all that said, limited number of platforms, though we could get some more. Limited number of sensors. We only have synthetic aperture radar and ground movement target indicator. Don't have EO, electrical optical, or IR, or FMV, or signals. But those are all sensor suites that could be purchased, could be employed. There's some other things that have to do with tactical data links, accreditation of the network for real-time, download. But bottom line is they've got great workarounds for their limitations right now. They've got plans to address some of the specific upgrades and modernizations they need, and that's in the pipeline. The bigger issue is the long-term view. The RQ4 is an old system. The life will unlikely be extended by much because it's being used at operational rate that was nowhere near that which was planned or funded for. And so its time is now to start thinking about the next capability to be acquired, and remembering all the difficulties at 28 or a little bit less to get to the acquisition, and then of course the whole .mil PFI type of fielding and now employment. So we need to be thinking about what's next, and we need to think about how can we perhaps integrate like-type systems from allies. They may not be high altitude, they might be medium altitude. And frankly, the command and control structure at the NATO AGS force can handle more forces, either NATO purchased and owned and operated, or allied contributions for rotational, temporary, or even permanent bases. So that's a capability that's not yet fully utilized, nor is the analyst training capability at Sigonella in Naples being fully leveraged right now. So there's more that we can get out of NATO AGS force than we're currently getting it, other than its systems operations.
Hopefully some renewed urgency with the war maybe, and this plug and play interoperability idea I think is one that's getting a lot of traction in the Alliance already. But Cheryl, can you please chime in from your perspective as well, because I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it does come back to a common operational picture ultimately. I mean, an RQ4 is going to have a certain range and endurance and field of view. Each sensor has to obey physics, right? It has a maximum detection range, a maximum range for being able to classify given objects and targets and such. And so this is a large region, right? And so for a given orbit, perhaps for a period of time, to Skip's point, you may have persistence for a given area for a period of time, but you're going to be limited in that. And it's not going to cover maybe all the area of responsibility that you're interested in. That's why I think it does come back to this common operational picture, and really, I would say kind of making it a quilt where you're stitching together different sources of information to provide that common operational picture. That means tapping into things like air traffic control radars, air surveillance radars from host nations, et cetera, commercial space-based capabilities. Sharing that with maybe, I'm making this up now, obviously, but if Poland buys some imagery, but is able to share that as part of that COP picture to help fill out what our understanding is of a particular region, it's wonderful that NATO has some capabilities, but they probably don't have sufficient capabilities for the need at hand. And so thinking through how do collectively we bring together capabilities, whether it's leveraging commercial space capabilities, whether it's putting more ground surveillance capabilities locations and tapping that in, but again, providing that common operational picture. We're pulling from nations that are willing to share that information, hopefully the raw data itself and not just finished products. I think that's where we need to go.
I know you might have thoughts on this as well, but we do have a question from the in-person audience. If I could ask you to please introduce yourself and your affiliation before we get started on the question.
So good morning, everyone. Didier Cormery. I'm the head of C4ISR for Airbus UA Space and Defense. And thank you very much for mentioning that we've just sold 2 very high-resolution imagery satellites to Poland. The segue is we see the proliferation of low Earth orbit ISR NCOMS constellations. How can we benefit from this, and what are the challenges and the roadblocks that need to be overcome? Thank you.
General Cartwright, do you want to take a stab at that first and
Sure.
go around the horn?
Low Earth orbit, I think looking at this current conflict and then aggregating out to broader conflicts, separate the fact that it's a commercial system. The fact that we have been able to take advantage of a disaggregated, survivable, persistent comm node called Starlink, dump it into the battle space, and instantly have users know how to use it and take advantage of it, and then think of ways to use it that we had never thought of before, applies to many of the disciplines that we're talking about right now. So the idea of gaining survivability by disaggregation has application in the airspace, has application on the ground, has application at sea. The idea that survivability is an attribute that is a fallout of that disaggregation, because knock one down, it's a self-healing network. If you get attacked in cyber as an example, most of the people that are involved in the Ukraine activity right now are sitting in wonderment of how well we've been able to defend that network. Okay? So those attributes of persistence, global, survivable, are way we need to think about what the low altitude band brings. But it is not taking a school bus and bringing it down from a higher orbit and putting it in LEO. It is a disaggregation, so that if you knock out one, if you spend $10 million to knock one down and it only costs you about 50 at the most, probably more like 5, you have a disincentive to even bother to attack it, because it's just not going to be fruitful for you. And so these are lessons that we can take from the commercial sector. They've been demonstrated there. We can port them over in any domain for most any problem. And I think the sensing side of this equation is the place to start, quite frankly. Because whether it's the Black Sea or the Yellow Sea, okay, it doesn't matter. Okay? These things are persistent globally. Okay? The comms and the command and control and the ISR is persistent globally. And that fundamentally changes the game. So a lot of the work that NATO is doing is trying to understand how to build these survivable, self-healing, disaggregated systems and move away from the American battle stars that we put up there and start to understand that mass still has an intrinsic value, and we have to start to bring it. The low Earth altitude, the low Earth orbit altitude brings speed, okay? You can basically, the network that is up there today was built for gamers. Less than 20 milliseconds any place on the face of the Earth. I can play a person on the opposite side of the Earth, and I can be under the speed at which my brain could ever perceive the changes, okay? It's a game changer. So this is a place where you want to start to think about it, and you want to start to think about sensing as well as comms. That's the key, quite frankly. And the processing side of this equation, if I learn something, if one of them get attacked, it only takes me a day to figure out how we were attacked and train 4,000 assets instantaneously. Fundamental game changer. So I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's an observation that we need to take on board.
And this quilting that Cheryl mentioned as well, but also one of my favorite acronyms is the Proliferated Low Earth Orbit, PLEO.
Yeah.
It's a fun one to say. But Skip, you've been waiting patiently. Please chime in.
No, I didn't want to chime in too quickly because I was very close to listening to what Jim was saying, because I think there's a lot of key aspects there, and he focused on speed, and of course he kind of referred to, in terms of global, the ubiquity of services and support that you get from space-based capabilities, and the volume, the flexibility and agility that the space-based services provides, resilience, and so all those things I think are critical. Now, for a couple of points on NATO's approach to space, they've had an operational space policy now for several years. Came back up in 2019, which basically said, no, NATO's not going to be, a actor in space, but it's going to benefit from its services, products, and data, et cetera, through the benefit of contributions from spacefaring nations. There is one of the largest NATO Communications Information Agency, NCIA's contracts for satellite communications for the alliance. And of course, that can be expanded and would have to be expanded, in time of operations or in collective defense scenario. And the kind of resilience would be, a big part of that. But also, there are not just national assets, there's a huge amount of commercial assets. And that's been the big transformation over the last decade, is this entry into space of commercial entities. And then, in the case of Ukraine, providing pro bono or through, allied or crowdsourced funding services to the Ukrainian government and forces for imagery and signals intelligence, for communications, et cetera, that have made a huge difference on the battlefield. And as these two newer kind of operational domains, at least for NATO, cyberspace and space, those are global, at least in terms of connectivity for cyberspace, and mediums for transmission of data that's critical for awareness, decision making, and action. And so one thing that NATO has recently done, I wrote about in the report, and it's now been publicized as of February, is this Alliance Persistence Surveillance System initiative. 17 now and 18 allies are providing funding to this kind of mechanism that allows for nations to provide space-based imagery, be it commercial or through national assets, for the alliance to then utilize for intelligence and the whole TCPID process, or in the case of at least two nations right now, providing some funding to NATO to actually decide on what tasks it would like to pose to commercial assets for collection, and therefore then their own process, exploitation, dissemination, et cetera. So that's a new aspect, and it's a great way of leveraging space-based capabilities from national and commercial assets. And I can only hope that it will continue to grow and expand in terms of funding and participation from allies.
I'm going to ask John if you want to come in on this, especially we've been talking about quilting together the commercial and the government piece a lot on this question.
So I'll just very quickly, I think the question was how, and I think that there's a challenge here, and Skip just addressed the fact that it's moving forward here. I think the challenge is the will, going back to the will of the governments to work together. This is a question of the task. Oftentimes the tasking of that satellite constellation is classified. And so how does that trust factor work with, I want to look here? And that's the fact that I'm looking there is classified. So the data itself, once it's aggregated, may also be classified. But there's a trust factor here that has to be overcome.
Just a real quick jump in on this. If there is an effort that's been kicked off in NATO that I think is going to take place in The Hague, where they're looking at AI and how to incorporate that in. Mm-hmm. There is a construct in AI that is basically separates your knowledge into two groups. That which is ground truth and that which is correlated truth, okay? And the idea here is that your classified assets, your intelligence assets are going to provide you with some sense of ground truth against which you'll take data and train. And if I sensed it with radar, but I can see it with EO, I can hand it to a commercial asset, have it look where I want it to look and tell me what it sees, because I could train it that quick. And so this effort in The Hague, I think, is really, really important for this issue, because it could start to change how we think about what's classified, sources and methods and capabilities, and how that classification can be diffused into a learning algorithm that teaches a different kind of sensor how to sense the same thing that's available in the commercial sector. And so there is a lot of opportunity here, and I think this effort that the NATO countries have thrown together has a lot of potential there. The only drawback I see right now is it's all scientists. It needs to be practitioners too.
And people who understand the legalities and the process and the policies too, that it can often also hinder the good technology, right? So we have Steve, who's waiting off wing here in the in-person audience. Steve, could you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, sure. I'm Steve Grundman, and I'm a senior fellow here at the council. This is an extraordinary, rich conversation of a kind that I think we all too rarely hear in Washington. So thank you, General Davis, for the outstanding report. Its depth notwithstanding, my question will ask you to bring the conversation up to what I'll call the executive or even the leadership level. So imagine the Secretary General is watching, or maybe his staff is watching, and someone's going to throw this report into his inbox. What are just a couple of executive level or leadership, maybe political even, I might call them, priorities that resolve from this conversation for the likes of a Secretary General? That's my question. And Leah, because as I look at the panel, I think you, as much as anyone on the panel, focuses on Brussels, NATO. If I may presume to invite you to weigh in on this as well, I'm going to do that.
Maybe I'll piggyback on what Skip led with in an earlier answer to a question, the importance of intelligence sharing. I think this is something that the U.S. government struggles with a lot, and I saw this in my jobs in the Pentagon, how hard it was to coordinate on policy and strategy when we're not able to have a common operating picture, as we keep coming back to. And I think, again, looking at the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, we won't call it lessons, but at least emerging observations, this intelligence piece is so important for enabling the rest of everything we're doing as an alliance, and it does take political leadership to overcome a lot of those barriers. Of course, there are also technical barriers, et cetera, but this political leadership is so important, and hopefully the alliance is moving towards that. But maybe I can I'll turn to Cheryl. It's been a little bit since we've had you chime in. So you are speaking with the Secretary General, and your number one piece of advice related to C4ISR is?
I would say the issue here is, how do we follow through now? There's efforts to, get this digital infrastructure moving. There's ways to engage. Well, the things that Skip has talked about in his report, right? Initiatives to engage with industry, et cetera. But how do we actually move forward to have those capabilities? What's that road ahead? And again, I'm an engineer, so I tend to be very practical. My advice would be focus on missions. What are the NATO missions that C4ISR needs to enable? And organize the people, the funding, the enterprise to go after enabling those missions. So we've talked about several of these, right? IMD, multi-domain operations that might be like suppression of enemy air defenses or counter UASs, et cetera. But take a mission level approach of what you are trying to enable going forward. Because we've covered a large landscape today, right? And there's a lot of moving parts that need to happen. And so I think we need to think through it in a way where we can concretely take action and steps going forward. So that would be mine. Focus on the missions that NATO C4ISR needs to enable.
And John, I'll turn to you, and then Jim, and then we'll end with Skip, because I know he has an entire report full of recommendations for the Secretary General.
I'll be very short, and I'll just say I agree. I think sharing of intelligence, sharing of data to build that common operating picture, to me that's that's a step right here. It's a matter of will to get that done. So I'll stop there.
And that's, I was speaking from a government to government perspective, but that's includes the industry perspective as well, right? Having enough trust in the private sector to be able to actually integrate when we're talking about these new technologies and new ways of doing business. But please, Jim.
I'm in Cheryl's camp here as far as thinking
Me
about
too,
this
for the record.
as an engineer. But to me, number one is to look at C4ISR and to go back to first principles. What is it I'm really trying to accomplish here? And then strip away all of the legacy, not because we're going to get rid of it, but because you just want to look at the problem without that bias. That's number one. And then number two is to replace computer with AI. I mean, it's misleading to talk. Nobody even thinks about, what are they talking about, computer? I mean, the reality here is that's where we're moving. It's computational power. It's the architecture of computational power. And think about it that way as an architecture, and think about it from first principles. What is it I'm trying to solve, and how do I get there?
So C4ISR.
Well, I wouldn't do that.
We'll workshop that.
But just acknowledge the fact that it's not computers anymore. It is really about AI, and even that's probably too general. But it is that architectural approach to the ability to distribute and get resilience and persistence and survivability out of that distribution.
And beyond just the hardware of the computer. Skip, please.
Okay, thanks, Leah, and thanks for all the other the comments that I just heard today. They resonate well with the recommendations I put together, and this helps, I think, amplify some of the importance for the Secretary General. In very simple terms, I tried to list 5 big policy recommendation areas: share more, transform. And a lot of this is continue to move on the path that's already been laid out in visions. And of course, as Cheryl said, implement. We've got to implement plans, concepts, and strategies that have been developed, but not yet, roadmapped out with objectives, funded, et cetera. Modernization in general, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then, of course, investing. And those are the big 5 categories that I think that my report speaks to. I would start off with, I talked about clarifying the architecture and requirements as a group, but this common, definition approach to C4ISR architecture, is critical, in my view, to enabling what C4ISR can do for multi-domain operations and multi-domain effects. And I think, as Jim said earlier, the soldier, the Marine, the airman, the sailor shouldn't have to be thinking about connectivity or interoperability or the effectiveness of the systems. That's the business of the people who put this system of systems together. It's the policymakers, it's the capability and concept developers, it's the integrators, it's industry. And so that's important, and I think the architecture would enable that and would also help at least clarify some of the enabling requirements for C4ISR. Data sharing, we've talked about already. And, this is where, in terms of trust, that, John talked a lot about, where there's still work to be done in terms of cybersecurity and data security. They have some great data exploitation framework policies. Okay, now it's all about, national compliance with capabilities, funding to get the kind of security and set up the data architecture to enable that data sharing, and then a political will to provide the intelligence, ideally the raw data. And then that, as I said before, within, this all idea about a more robust, resilient, and secure data and network architecture to enable C4ISR and what it produces for exploitation, dissemination, and then connecting, understanding, decision, and action. Clarity on future requirements is another set, and that is that, we're now in a new NATO defense planning cycle. They've just issued Political Guidance 23, which includes an increased level of ambition of requirements. We used to say that defense planning was capability-based and threat-informed. Now the threat has a big T, okay, and a capital T. It's definitely still threat-informed, but threat-specific, not generic. And so, that's going to lead to more specific requirements in the new NATO force model, which entails a whole vast increased number of forces ready on day zero, as well as those ready in short order to respond to collective defense and enable deterrence by denial. Without which you're not going to scare off a very capable adversary like Russia. Notwithstanding all the problems we see in Ukraine, they can still deliver massive destruction on NATO countries' forces and architecture and infrastructure. And then the other aspect is there's going to be a new C2, a structure that'll fall out of some recommendations. That's still to be delivered by SACEUR, but that will eventually come out. And in order to enable this strength in deterrence and defense, there's going to be some significant changes to the command structure, to the force structure, to streamline, what NATO needs for collective defense across its entire, area of responsibility as well. And then in terms of the modern capabilities, we talked a lot about the neat things that are available now in the market. They're being tested in Ukraine that NATO needs. Okay, they need to be acquired. And there's some really interesting, industry innovation initiatives. So we didn't really get to talk about the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, or the NATO Innovation Fund, but those are really promising initiatives. The first strategic areas for the challenges are out. They include sensing and sensing and intelligence and information sharing that will be set out to industry soon this year, and require responses. And then they'll either be acquired through national funding, or the NATO industry funding as a venture capital focused fund can also enable rapid scaling up of promising solutions. So all that is in the future. And then the last one is investment. And the Defense Investment Pledge, we've all heard about the importance of it. 8 out of 30 allies need it now. Okay, still a lot of work to be done. Our partners Sweden and Finland do, by the way, and the potential candidates. And then there's investment in defense capabilities writ large, yes, but I would also say into readiness. We've seen these huge issues with the Leopard 2s from across nations and our own own tanks and everything that we've wanted to provide to Ukraine. Then of course interoperability, and John's hit that numerous times. That's absolutely critical for an effective defense and response. And then finally, the ability to integrate all these through the right kind of connective tissue. Sorry, I went a little bit over that, but over time. But thanks for the opportunity to talk about the report and the wonderful panel that joined me in this whole C4ISR discussion.
No, thank you so much, Skip. You hit so many great points right at the end there, too, and I feel like we could go for a few more hours at least talking about this. But, hitting at the end there the ends and the ways and the means that we're talking about addressing these problems. And I think it's so important to be looking at this as the nervous system of NATO as we're looking to the summit in Vilnius. There are a lot of decisions that are on the table. There are a lot of announcements that are going to be made. But we've talked about all of the ways that this critical backbone of NATO's operations really needs to be modernized and interoperable, and better connections with the private sector, spending more money. So we have a lot on our plates and agenda, and I really appreciate everyone here in the audience for joining us today, and we hope that we can keep the conversation on these issues going. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council and our partner for this event, Leonardo DRS, thank you so much for joining us today, and I encourage everyone to read the report. It's now available online, and I have one printed copy here. Maybe I can hand it off to the first bidder in the in-person audience, but thank you so much.
Thanks again.